the English Civil War, fought between 1642 and 1646, or 38, or 39, or 41, and up to 46 or 48 or 49 or 51, depending on how you look at things and how you define things. Well, the English Civil War was fought between Oliver Cromwell and his dour, puritanical Roundheads against King Charles I and his jolly Cavaliers. And, I mean, it really wasn't all that bad anyway. Right? Well, no. Hang on a minute. King Charles was definitely in charge of the royal side, and Cromwell became Lord Protector, king in all but name, so he must have been in charge of Parliament. So it must have been a fight for the English throne between English folks. So how is it not true? Well, for a start, the English Civil War, or the English Civil Wars, it's a fairly modern name, a fairly modern interpretation, and it describes only part of the fighting, which made up a series of overlapping and confusing civil wars and domestic conflicts in England and in Ireland and in Scotland and in Wales. And they were fought between about 1638 and 1651, or maybe going up to 1660, depending on how you look at things and depending on how you define things. And it's been called various things by contemporaries at the time and shortly after, and in the periods of tense peace that there were in between all, the violence. And historians across the 4 centuries have used various names to describe various parts or the whole of the thing. But even if you just consider the fighting in England and in Wales, what we now refer to, or is generally referred to, as the English Civil War, or English Civil Wars, or the First English Civil War between King and Parliament between 1642 and 1646 or 1648, well, it misses out on the fact that there were 3 sides, 3 factions, 3 groups in England and in Wales. You had the king and his supporters, who were called Cavaliers, and that was a period insult, but it was an insult they wore and transformed into a badge of pride. And then there was Parliament, and their supporters were sometimes called Roundheads, but it was, again, an insult they weren't so keen on and that they didn't adopt. And there were lots of Puritans amongst the supporters of Parliament, but there were Puritans or godly folks that supported the king, or whose support for Parliament was less enthusiastic. And there were religious people on both sides that weren't Puritans, and there were lots of parliamentarians that were not puritanical at all. And even some of those that we were, and some of the people you look at and go, well, that's definitely a Puritan, really weren't. So it's a great simplification and simply not true. And it misses out on the fact that there was a third group that weren't Roundheads, that weren't parliamentarians, that weren't Cavaliers, that weren't Royalists. They were Scottish, and they were not Scottish Royalists, and they existed, and they were not Scottish parliamentarians, and they really didn't exist. They were Scots Covenanters. They'd sworn the solemn oath and covenant to protect their way of life, to protect their church government, the Scottish Kirk. And they weren't fighting against the king to replace the king. They were fighting to really maintain their way of governing their life and their church. And also, the English Civil War, if you want to use that term, it wasn't fought only in England, or England and Wales, or by the English, or by the English and the Welsh. So the term is overly simplistic. Also, whilst we have the impression of this being a fairly civil war, as in reasonably polite and not too destructive, this was only true as much as it was at all true in England and Wales and in Scotland, so in Britain, and only as true as it was in comparison to the big wars in the continent. The 30 Years' War was perhaps the most destructive European war of all times in terms of misery and displacement and death and destruction of land and buildings and lives, and the 70 Years' War, it wasn't very jolly either. And in comparison to the bit of the War of the Three Kingdoms or the British Civil Wars that were fought in Ireland, then maybe in England it was kind of okay, but only comparatively. See, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms were brutal. A relatively recent estimate suggests that there were as many as 250,000 war-related deaths, both military and civilian, in Britain during the conflicts, and that would amount to something like 5% of the population. This was a much greater percentage of the population than 2.6% who died in the First World War. I mean, admittedly, that was fought primarily away rather than at home, but even so, we don't think of the First World War as being, relatively okay, and we shouldn't think of this either. And deaths in Ireland were even worse. They probably numbered at least 250,000, perhaps well over that, and it's likely this was around 15 to 20% of the pre-war population. But in Ireland, always things are less secure, less certain, and more up for debate, in part because records were just not as meticulously kept, and in part because there was an awful lot of destruction, and paper is quite burnable. So, the English Civil War wasn't English, fought by the English or in England, and it wasn't fought for control of the English throne, although that was certainly the outcome of that part of the civil wars that were fought in the 1630s through to 1650s or 60s. And it wasn't civil. It was a very uncivil civil war, as are pretty much, without exception, all civil wars. It was, however, a war. So the English Civil War was not English, was not civil, but was a war.